name is Jay Wegman. I'm the director here, and I welcome our in-house folks and to the vast number of people out on the internet who are watching us online. This is truly our first public program back in the space, and I couldn't be more thrilled than to welcome our esteemed panelists and our folks in the audience. And I welcome you all to Reopening, ? Rethinking New York City's Performance Infrastructures. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Brandon Goupil.
Thanks, Jay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, both here and out there on the interwebs. My name is Brandon Wolf. I'm a professor here at NYU's English department, where I also direct the program in dramatic literature. And I just wanted to start with a couple of thank yous, and then I'm going to give a little context for the panel and then introduce everyone and then get off the stage. So this event's been generously supported by the NYU Center for the Humanities, Tisch Drama, NYU's English department, the program in dramatic literature, and most special thanks to all the folks here at NYU Skirball who just worked so hard to pull this event together as the first in-person thing we've done in a long, long time. This symposium's also, after a long COVID break, the first convening of the working group in drama, theater, and performance studies. And this is a working group I co-organize with Elisa Zulina, Sebastian Calderon-Bentin, and Jay De Leon. And we're trying to provide a forum for different forms of cutting-edge research and practice in theater, dance, performance studies, and dramatic literature. Now, today's event is the first in a series of events we hope to stage this year to explore evolving relations between performing arts and the infrastructures of their support. Now, in the wake of COVID, as we've all been looking forward to and looking towards reopening here in New York, so many of our cultural organizations have vowed to change how they do business, vowed to do better, to stand for anti-racism, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And with this event today, we hope to stage a kind of collective inquiry together with these two panels to think through what real transformation could look like, what is being reopened, how, for whom, how might we reopen differently, and what kinds of questions need we pose together publicly. So for this conversation, I'm just so thrilled to welcome such an exciting lineup of guests who will lead us through these 2 hour-long conversations, and their full and extremely impressive bios are on Skirball's website. So I'm just going to introduce them very briefly so that then we can have a sort of quick run of show between the two panels. So for the first panel on what we're calling institutional imaginations, we'll be joined by Melanie Joseph, artistic producer of the Foundry Theater, Eric Kleinenberg, professor and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge here at NYU, Chris Myers, who's an organizer with AntiCapitalism for Artists over there, and April Mathis, who is a performer here in New York and a member of the collective Afro-Phenomenon. Did I say that right?
You did.
Cool. And then Hilary Miller, who's a professor at Queens College, is going to be our respondent and conversant today, okay? And then for the second panel of folks who aren't out here on the stage yet, who will be exploring questions of labor and equity in our performance infrastructures, we'll hear from Shelley Ataji, who's an attorney and a judicial law clerk at the U.S. District Court in the Southern District here in New York, from Jimena Garnica, who's a choreographer and organizer with Arts Workers Rally, from Adam Krauthammer, who's president of Local 802, American Federation of Musicians, and from Ruth Milkman, distinguished professor of sociology and history at the CUNY Graduate Center and the Labor Studies Chair at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And that panel will be chaired by Shani Enelo, who's a professor at Fordham University. So we've invited each panelist to present briefly some of their thoughts and experiences, and afterwards our respondents, Hilary and then Shani in the next panel, will join to moderate the conversation with the 4 panelists, and we'll plan to conclude around 4:15. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today in person, online. We're so thrilled that you're here and so much looking forward to the conversation. Thanks a million.
Do I go first? Oh, sorry, everyone. My name is
Melanie Joseph, and I think I'm probably one of the older, or if not oldest, radicals.
Melanie, would you mind just going a little closer to the mic?
Hi,
Perfect. Thank you.
sorry. My name is Melanie Joseph, and I assume, I think correctly, that I'm probably the oldest radical in this bunch. And so I'd like to acknowledge three of the elders whose shoulders I stand on, especially for today's conversation. And they are Ruth Malachek, Judith Molina, and Grace Lee Boggs. Three powerful outliers who are still world-changing to this day. So in 1994, I founded the Foundry Theater, which I then led and co-led with theater makers Sundar Ganglani and Ann Irby and community organizer RJ McConney. It was a 25-year experiment in the ongoing creation of a theater company that was expressed by the art we made and the contexts we addressed to contain it. We considered all of our events as invitations with which to gather an authorized and participatory public who in turn continued to impact the company's evolution. I actually formed the company to create connections between theater artists and social justice workers at a time when this wasn't happening anywhere in New York City theater. It was both about really rigorous art making and hosting rigorous public dialogues and conversations about building another more just world and how we could do so together. The Foundry itself was like an evolving, the institution of the Foundry was itself an evolving art project. And we often refer to it more as an organism in the ecology of changing the world than an organization in the American theater. We chose not to have a permanent space. We never had a season or subscribers. We practiced budget transparency in all ways. In fact, we published our budgets in our programs. We paid all project collaborators in relation to our permanent staff salaries. Childcare and translation became permanent line items in all our events budgets. Our board was purposefully only 3 people, the 3 that is mandated by New York State for fiscal oversight. We never, ever had a budget, never. Pardon me, we never had a deficit. We always had a budget. We never, ever had a budget. I can't believe I'm saying this. We never, ever had a deficit in 25 years, ever. I feel like I'd like to wear a sandwich board with pride to say that. In addition to shared leaderships, we did our best to create a democratic and horizontal workplace, staying away from siloed positions and management. I've always maintained that we know how to manage ourselves. A lot has changed in the theater community over the past years, particularly the radicalization of traditionally liberal theater artists. Until Occupy Wall Street, I couldn't even use the word capitalism without being teased as a hippie, or worse, during the Reagan years, being dismissed as one of those political artists. Now, there's anti-capitalism for artists, dedicated to raising class consciousness. Thank you, Chris Myers, blessing on your head. Over the years at the Foundry, theater artists were in short supply at our dialogues, even when Grace Lee Boggs or Naomi Klein came to speak with us. Perhaps they too were just too political. We never understood it. Now, all sorts of theater folks are joining various social justice campaigns via the indefatigable organizing of amplifying activists. Hats off to Natasha Sinha and her colleagues. And now, we're at a really powerful, I think, potentially pivotal moment on the clock of the world as we emerge from COVID and start making, producing, and inviting audiences again. We'd been hearing one another say repeatedly that we don't want to return to the way things were. And given the amazing organizing taken on by artists, many newly radicalized theater artists who demanded that theaters implement meaningful racial justice practice, and those theaters actually adopting and committing publicly to those practices, it indeed offers a new heartbeat to return to. I can't help but consider these anti-racist practices as also containing some really powerful leverage with which to take apart some of the decrepit corporate structures of theaters and other arts institutions. Indeed, that may be unavoidable since the actual fulfillment of many of the promises will likely more often be left to the siloed workers in those institutions to negotiate, deal with, and enact. However the leverage shows up, I think it's also a sustainability boon, a way to install racial justice permanently in newly structured organizations. I was listening to a really interesting panel the other day called "What Does Anti-Racist Producing Look Like?" It's now on HowlRound if you want to take a look. It's really a great panel. One of the panelists, Denzel Faison from the National Black Theater, was asked how producers can begin laying a foundation for these anti-racism processes. And he answered by saying that acknowledging and taking steps to dismantle racial capitalism is at the crux of anti-racist producing. I find a lot of intersectional vitality and very good direction in that answer. So we're here today to talk about institutional imagining in these times now. No offense, dear organizers, but I prefer to imagine institutions and probably change the noun back and forth until we find better ones. It bears noting, I think, that artists had very little, if anything, to do with creating the institutional structures that run the American theater today. And though they are indeed nonprofits, they very quickly adopted corporate business models and capitalist principles, neither of which seeks to support aesthetic experimentation or progressive intentions. There's no money in either. For a long while, I've been convinced that starting now, right now, all American theaters must be run by artists and makers, not by one, but by more than one. They're simply better equipped to bring the fluidity, the adventurousness, and human focus that nurtures the making and producing of theater. They understand what's normal about setting out to make one thing that becomes something entirely different, and that journey must be supported in whatever direction it goes. Makers, and I include social justice organizers in that term, makers are incredible at holding aloft what isn't there, what may never have been there before, until it may be. Putting today's artists and makers in charge of how these institutions can be run differently is, in my opinion, long overdue. And given that these are artists, I don't want to imagine ever a specific model for them all, or even for one of them to adopt or commodify as the structure of arts institutions. God help us. Rather, I hope they can muster the freedom and that the boards and subscribers they inherit will allow them the imaginative space to rebuild their company uniquely, both internally in their workplace culture and in the neighborhoods and communities that surround each one. It's been amazing, really, to watch the prolific leadership changes in the American theater. New artistic directors have brought passionate commitment to the progressive anti-racist policies their new theaters have adopted. Some of these artistic directors have already brought in posses of artists to share programming and very likely to build the future of the organization. What remains to be seen, I think, is what kind of resistance they will meet, both inside and outside their organizations, and how intense it will be. Will they be hobbled by the structures, by the grant makers, the galas, the government, that were all designed to protect and preserve the capitalist class? Or can they overcome these entrenched elite interests and discover that a new world, a new way of living, a new way of making theater is possible, and indeed is already underway? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I guess when you're up here, you're supposed to say that's a tough act to follow. And it is, but I think almost any act right now, no matter how tough it would be, would also feel extraordinary, because there's something about being up on a stage in a room like this that I've missed, that we've been waiting for. And I'm a sociologist, and I miss being up on a stage, so I can only imagine what people in the theater world feel. As I get going, the first thing I want to do is thank the organizers and also the staff from Skirball for putting this together. As we came in, we were told, this is the first live event in this space since March of 2020. And that is an amazing thing. It feels like a kind of breakthrough, the good kind of breakthrough to have. And I'm so thrilled to be a part of it. And I hope it's the inauguration of something that we get to kind of live fully inside of. Because there's something now about the way we're living which feels kind of functional. I don't know if you have this experience. Like, we're kind of making do with a lot of things. Like, we figured out how to teach our classes, and we've figured out how to get to work and use kind of the bare basics for life. But there's a thing that I think has been very hard for us to recover, that this place and this environment and this institution kind of symbolizes so powerfully, and that is this kind of feeling of collective joy and transcendence, where you go from the kind of ordinary day to something that's really special. Sociologists have this great phrase for it. It comes from one of our founding figures, Emil Durkheim. He had this idea that he called collective effervescence. I love this concept, collective effervescence, and it comes from his research on religious life. And the idea is that when we live in kind of ordinary times, we're in this mundane world of the everyday. We work hard. We have responsibilities we have to take care of. There could be special moments in that, but it's the world of the mundane, what we need to do to get by. And when Durkheim wrote about religion, what he said is, this is a sacred space. And when people come into these kind of sacred, special places, they're able to be together, to break from the routine and build something that collectively allows for the experience of transcendence. So that, when you walk into the place, you're in a different area. There's all sorts of kind of rituals that mark the time and space is different. And I think for a lot of us, for sure, a lot of us in New York City, but I think for a lot of people in the modern world, the theater is like that sacred space. And it's not just the proper theater, it's the arena where we come together to do live things collectively. Some days I feel that way about the classroom where I teach, that it becomes a special place where we can be together. And I think one of the things that has been so profoundly difficult for me and for so many people in my world is the sense that over the last year and a half, there has been a struggle to survive. There has been the kind of difficult battle with death and disease and suffering on a scale that we're not accustomed to. There's been a move to kind of get back to life. But now I think we're getting to another frontier, which is the kind of push to get to sacred spaces where we can have something that feels like transcendent and collective and joyous and powerful, effervescent. And I think, as a sociologist, I think those things are not just kind of incidental experiences. Those things are not about the experience of an individual person to get to some other place. It's our shared social life that we come to build something like a collective, like something like a collective politics, so that when we reach for something, it's the kind of transformative extension of ourselves, as opposed to just kind of keeping things going. It's hard to search for and fight for the common good. It's hard to do better, to achieve justice, if we're acting on our own. That's the kind of thing that we do, collectively, and we need physical places to do that. We need physical places to do that. I don't think we do that on Twitter. I don't. And so, in my work, I write about. I wrote a book a few years ago called "Palaces for the People," which is about this concept I've been using called social infrastructure. And the argument I've been making for years is that the conversation about infrastructure, and infrastructure came up in our, in the introduction to this panel and to this event. We care about the infrastructures of performance and the infrastructures of collective life. For years, our conversation about infrastructure has been impoverished by our failure to imagine all the ways in which collective life is predicated on the physical places that we build. And so even today, as we watch, Congress fight over whether there will be an investment in infrastructure, let alone whether that infrastructure investment will have to do with bridges and tunnels and airports and energy systems alone, or whether it will be something bigger that will involve potentially health and education and care work, and whether it will involve support for creative industries and for cultural industries, as our infrastructure bill and infrastructure projects did 90 years ago, 85 years ago, when we rebuilt the country through a New Deal. I think it's essential that we keep in mind that coming together, experiencing this kind of collective effervescence is only possible if we can build places that support it and sustain it, that foster it, encourage it, that allow it to be part of our life more routinely. And I say that because, while no doubt people in the Tisch community and people who are part of this world of New York City culture have been celebrating much more than the reopening of Broadway, in the last few weeks, the national conversation in popular culture about the reopening of the cultural world and of New York City has been the reopening of Broadway. And I guess I enjoy a good Broadway show too, but there's something about the reopening of what might be the most inaccessible theatrical space in the world, just by sheer virtue of the cost of a ticket, that I think should give us pause. Because if, to reopen the place that is symbolically so powerful, but is so closed anyway, all the time, to people who don't have at minimum $70, $80, $100 to sit in the top row, and possibly hundreds more to get anywhere near where the action is, that's not enough. If we just reopen Broadway, it's not enough. And so then the question is, what does a real reopening mean? What is a real reopening? What does a real transformation mean? And I think that that's something that we don't do, with the big firms that are running Broadway. It's not something we do with the capitalist marketplace. I think that's something we do in our collective politics. And it's why, and it just happens to be the day that we're in this battle for our future in infrastructure politics. But I think it's why, when we talk about what it means to rebuild institutions and to remake popular culture and access to culture, by all means, I want the artists, involved in creating things, but I also want all of us to make a public and political commitment to doing that with our shared resources. Because I think what really distinguishes a decent society, an open society that has opportunity and bends towards justice, is a widespread and ethical commitment to access, to belonging. It has to be anti-racist. It has to be attentive to the ways in which inequalities are organized by class shape so much of our lives. And it has to be dramatically different than it is today. So I want to end there with just a message that I hope, as we reopen, we push that concept to its limits. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. I am not used to panels, so I did prepare a written statement. And I will also say that folks who know me well outside of the stage know that I'm actually a pretty shy, reticent person, and not used to public speaking. I like words that I've memorized already. These will not be those. To me, a real reset looks like institutions demonstrating their value for artists. This means putting our health and safety first and foremost. This means paying us what we're worth and being upfront and transparent about what is expected of us with each project. In the wake of the pandemic, this means disclosing pay and safety guidelines for any in-person engagements from the first exchange with the artist. That is, before I am asked to read a lengthy description of how this potential work came about or what your institution hopes to achieve with my participation, I need to know how much you are able to pay and what safety protocols you have in place. As theaters and performance spaces have started to resume workshops, readings, and productions, it has been disappointing when I've had to seek out this information myself, sometimes over several emails. While everyone has their own degree of risk assessment and the science is continually evolving on best safety practices for this infection, I have felt safest to work in spaces where there has been a demonstrated best effort towards safety. I'll briefly give two examples of positive ways to work I've seen re-entering live performance. I recently participated in the Philadelphia Fringe Festival, where Elevator Repair Service, a theater company I've been a part of since 2007, was invited to premiere Baldwin Buckley at Cambridge, a restaging of the 1965 debate between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley. As is standard for ERS, we had a company meeting before we left town where salary and per diem for every member attending the festival were listed on a spreadsheet. For the festival engagement, as per equity guidelines, our company had to provide proof of vaccination as well as pass a COVID test upon arrival before rehearsals began. All festival staff and crew interacting with the production were masked throughout the process and backstage, and actors were masked as well when we weren't performing. When it was brought to the festival coordinator's attention after the first preview that audience mask compliance was an issue, this was addressed the following performance at the curtain speech by festival personnel. This summer, before the Delta variant took hold in NYC, I was part of Afrofeminonomy, a collective of female identifying and non-binary Black artists, which produced a series of curated, mostly outdoor events celebrating the work of playwright and filmmaker Kathleen Collins. As a collective, we agreed health and safety were priorities, and from its inception, our conversations around protocols and were transparent and collaborative. Artists who felt unsafe on public transit were given a travel stipend, and in addition to a participation fee, my health premium was paid for the quarter. This project was co-produced with PSNY and New George's. These are not billion-dollar institutions, but they chose to prioritize the health and safety of the artists and found ways to honor that in actions we could measure. Often we are told as artists about the financial hardships of institutions, with the expectation that we will donate our labor out of a spirit of collaboration and higher ideals of art. I look forward to more organizations asking artists what we need and making good on those requests. From my work in the Fair Wage on Stage movement for off-Broadway wage increases back in 2017, I learned that one of the strongest tools for accountability is transparency. There is a long-held misconception inside and outside of the industry that performers are inherently needy, attention-seeking children who would do it for free because they love it so much. In reality, we know that performing artists are professionals who have a bottom line, families to support, and rent and mortgages to pay. Many of us live paycheck to paycheck and supplement our work with jobs outside of live performance. Since COVID, a lot of that supplementary work has now dried up or become less safe to navigate. Most members of the audience are unaware how little their admission ticket actually goes to the performers. Going forward, I would like to see institutions put a living wage into their EID statements and make their pay schedules transparent and readily accessible so audiences can see which institutions truly value their artists and decide where to lend their support. Like many of us, I have been heartened and encouraged by artist collectives that have publicly demanded accountability from institutions. I have noticed a difference in the rooms I've entered since. People are invited to share their pronouns, land acknowledgements are made, statements toward anti-racism have been made. These are easy ways to make artists feel seen and they are welcome. However, when they're not undergirded with living wages and clear safety protocols, these gestures can seem hollow. we can't truly say we see you when institutions hide from us. I look forward to a return to live performance that puts its money where its mission statement is. Thank you.
Today, in speaking about the process of reopenings, I will attempt to work at two ends. First, as an educator and organizer attempting to theoretically locate arts institutions within the inertia of our larger political economy, capitalism. And secondly, as an arts worker currently taking part in a reopening and feeling that inertia in real time. Even though this panel is about institutional imagining with both frames, my primary subject and most hopeful audience is the arts worker, because it is that overwhelming majority of people upon which I believe all lasting change rests. The questions grounding this event are as follows, and I quote, how do we hold cultural institutions accountable to real change? What is being reopened? How and for whom? My instinct is to attempt to root out the political dimensions within those questions and orient them towards something approaching a theory of change. The specter haunting questions of accountability is power. One either has it or one doesn't. Making friends with this wayward spirit lays bare questions around who's doing what for whom when talking about reopenings or any other collective event. Accountability, for instance, cannot mean causing a ruckus on social media only for an institution to eke out a boilerplate statement of acknowledgement, as so many did during their so-called racial reckonings. Accountability in an institutional sense must be a collective process whereupon all parties equally participate, notably with the most affected party in the driving seat and with transformative material outcomes. For starters, this requires said affected party to have a meaningful impact on the working of the institution and thus some form of power. So one way to begin is with an honest appraisal of power, my power, your power, their power, and most importantly, our power, worker power, collective power. We must also take note of the various mechanisms that each party has to build and maintain power and thus materialize or obstruct change. Whose interests and needs are primarily being served across each strata of the institution? Are institutions aligned with collective power, with communities of working people? We must also pay some attention to change and admit that we seldom all have the same thing in mind when we utter the word. Is the change that we want to integrate into an existing order the very thing that got us here? Do we want representation to have our chance at being overworked and underpaid? Or do we want structural change, systemic change? What is the difference? What is the different cost between structural or systemic and representational or integrative change? Does focus on the one hamper progress on the others? How can we be sure we're all heading toward the same horizon with an informed consent? And this brings us to reopenings. First, we might ask, what is the history of the initial opening? Which is to say, how did these arts institutions come into being and who have they historically served? Did the event of closing have any effect on altering that trajectory? Or is that merely our optimistic idealism? We might ask not just what is reopening, but why and how is the reopening? In my view, arts institutions have many uses and thus many things are being reopened all at once. They are creative production facilities, a place where we make things that have never existed before, where we do what we love and find satisfaction and perhaps purpose. They are also importantly our workplaces and thus where we procure the wages we put toward our survival under capitalism. They're often a source of our precious health insurance. Through the social interaction we encounter in our work lives and the hierarchies in place, they are also sites of racial, gendered, and sexual violence, of ongoing depression, anxiety, and trauma, of disinclusivity. Finally, they are the places of commerce and commodity, the places where we sell those things that we make. They are tax sinks for the wealthy, celebratory play spaces for the elite, distant citadels that casually reproduce the structural inequalities coded into the social order outside their walls. We should conceive of reopenings as a moment of ongoing movement in line with the same general forces that govern the rest of our lives. Reopenings of our institutional workplaces are, much like the rest of our working lives, generally about unrestricting the barriers to the free flow of capital. This process has taken place in many sectors, with the arts being only one. In all cases, there is a tension between allowing for the necessity of the free flow of capital and the wants and needs of the workers who makes the institution what it really is. Due to reasons that always come down to power, the tendency has most commonly been to exert the least cost in subverting the effects of the pandemic or whatever crisis beckons so that the show can go on. None of this is provocative. This is what is required of enterprise under capitalism. And nonprofits aren't clear of this tendency because they still must center the whims of capital in how they generate support, even if filtered through grants or donations. So once we properly identify reopenings as an imbalanced outcome of the social relations of capital, the question now becomes not how have institutions changed, but how have we as workers? Not what will reopen, but how will we return? I recently heard a mental health provider say of his work that COVID is a devastating illness, but it is also just one illness that complicated the existing treatment of many existing illnesses. How does this track with the ongoing work of equity and decolonization in arts and culture institutions? Let us be frank, COVID did huge swaths of damage to communities, the effects of which we will continue to feel for years to come. How did the majority of our cultural institutions show up beyond, at most, trying to pivot their production to the digital space? How have they created spaces for mourning, for processing and healing? As climate change continues to become the crisis event of our time, how has the pandemic revealed what portends for the institution under crisis? The answer must be found in the time between so-called crises and the work being done now. Arts institutions concerned with change must ask themselves, who do they primarily serve? Who primarily informs the work, community or capital? Capital shows up in donor worship, utilizing gatekeepers, hiring customs, marketing, the use of unpaid internships and debilitating work schedules. It's not just the work presented, but the way the work is made and presented. It's ideological even, like the trend of building bars and restaurants in the facility that most employees can't afford to patronize. Community focus looks like developing workplace democracy, providing elder care and childcare for workers and audiences alike, making living wages the baseline, improving the quality of work, increasing benefits, developing models of cooperative ownership, and integrating the institution into the fabric of the community through open, unrestricted access. It means giving the most essential and invisibilized workers at our institutions, cleaning staff, security, maintenance, etc., the power to shape the healthy functioning of the collective right alongside creative laborers and administration. A friend remarked, theaters should be like libraries. Right now, they're trending rather like Amazon, basking in neoliberal decadence. To accomplish this, institutional administration and management must dare to be in, but not of their workplaces. From their position of power, they must listen to and respect the workers and labor that, most of all, gives meaning to their existence. And arts workers, we have a responsibility to speak up. In preparing for this talk, I spoke with arts workers currently in the middle of reopenings, and there are some very obvious overarching themes. They all, myself included, feel thrust into the very normal everyone swore they would not go back to. And while this speed and quality of work may have felt intense before the pandemic, it creates the feeling of whiplash for the majority of us who have not revved our creative engines in 18 months. Workers are horrified by what they see as a lack of gentleness, of collective purpose, after what the events of the past year and a half have destabilized. If anything, the biggest boon for the lucky few has been more days off and shorter days at work. We are still in a pandemic, and most of us have not processed the pandemic we have experienced so far. The stakes are high. This is a crucial time for workers to vocalize the basic needs they have and organize around them. We have to root out the feelings of alienation, competitiveness, and individualism so endemic to our industries. For artists in particular, we have to draw a firm line between the pleasure of what we do and the labor of it. But all of us must dare to be disappointed and do something about it. Our dreaming can be so bold. We have to look past mobilizing around singular issues of the day and into organizing long-term campaigns that get at structural issues. Shout out to IATSE. To do this, we must study, gather over events and information, consider history and theory, and strategize. Workers and institutions need to collaborate in the work of structural transformation, in conversation with communities and in conjunction with other industries and sectors. What if institutions saw this work as part of their prerogative? What if our spaces of shared creative labor open themselves up to modeling the way things could be, rather than reflecting back the way they are? We would take care of each other a hell of a lot more. And believe it or not, there would be immense joy to be found. My short time embracing political education and organizing has been a great choice of my life, knowing that through the ups and downs, I am marching toward a clear horizon with other empowered workers. This is solidarity, the crucial element in changing paradigms. Arts institutions can be hotbeds of community development and worker empowerment, and they can be sites of prefigurative transformation and generative struggle. This will undoubtedly be marked with failure and fear, but that is the only way we'll learn how to do better. In the short term, it will produce stark outcomes. Soho Rep's Project Number 1 did precisely this during the pandemic, putting its resident artists on salary with full benefits like proper workers and not freelancers thrown into the winds of precarity during an unprecedented global crisis. And I am emboldened by the movement of art.coop as they gather resources on the solidarity economy and highlight how artists can participate in liberating their systems of work. I must also uplift Reimagining Public Theaters as Collectively Organized Cultural Institutions by Zenko Bogdan, also on HowlRound, a stunning proposal for what a truly public institution might look like. A better world is possible, and the work being done to make it happen is already happening around us. Claudia Jones has given us the wisdom that a people's art is the genesis of their freedom. This must not be limited to art in the commodity form. Cultural products like art come from a people's given culture. This is the level at which we must work. By pivoting arts and cultural institutions away from the grasp of capital and centering the communities and workers that truly make them possible, we can manifest transformative possibilities for meeting the next crisis with collective power, the greatest power of all. Claudia Jones famously organized a historic carnival in England. That quote, it was the event slogan. I do suspect that our march toward transformation can be full of music, dancing, and art too. And in a word, joy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. That was wonderful. I'm Hilary Miller. It's great to be here. So my interest as respondent is just to keep the conversation going. So in terms of my immediate response is that I'm inspired by some of the sense of optimism. I mean, I use that word pretty cautiously, but I think what I heard across the four speakers was critique and frustration, and yet, well, fear, you know, all of these emotions that included a strong dose of maybe glimpsing some other possibilities. And one of the ways that, one of the things that stood out for me was the idea that maybe there's been some changes also just in how we communicate with each other. And that as artists ask for certain things and audiences ask for certain things, maybe everybody is taking closer looks at how they're communicating across the board. So that was exciting for me to hear. That was the optimistic part. that maybe the searching that some people have been doing has turned into more than just statements that might prove empty down the line, but actually have teeth. So a couple of thoughts and questions. One of them is I was interested in sort of the role that history plays here. So I was excited, Melanie, you know, when you began intoning these massive figures that have inspired us, and the question of not wanting to just repeat what was obviously broken before, but also not wanting to be obsessed with this idea of models. I like that idea. We don't really need models. Actually, we kind of just need space to imagine. So I would sort of love to ask, and Chris, you did this a little bit, but what are we could call them formations, organisms, what are the groups that are doing things really well, really right? Like following April's suggestion of, this made me feel good as an artist in this instance. You know, are there spaces, are there activists that we can look to and say, right now, this gives me hope concretely for the future? And people already started doing this, but if there was something that you wanted to sort of dig into a little bit more, I'd be excited to hear that.
Another maker institution holder that I'll shout out is Ralph Pena with Foundry Theater. Together with Aaron Landsman, Erica Chong-Shuk, and Flaco Jimenez, we began a project that was commissioned, that began over Zoom, and was commissioned by Mayi. And as we started working on it, the working title was Your House is Your Tree. And we came from different disciplines to develop something. And as we met and kind of talked and dealt with, like, this is where we are now, we're in different cities. Will this be something that will be producible in New York or somewhere else? And, you know, what is the timeline? It evolved, and we got to a place where we were, if we were being honest, we did not necessarily, we weren't really working toward a product and a show to premiere. And we had that conversation with Ralph, and he said, yes, what you're working on is infinitely more interesting than trying to slapdash together some project, some product. for us to sell that is not really what it is. Like it reminded me, Melanie, when you were talking about like holding aloft something that isn't anything yet. And what happened was we were paid for our time to keep meeting and thinking through and developing and dreaming out. And it was always like, you know, we're 4 people who could make something, you know, if that's what you wanted, if you wanted this 2-month timeline, you know, 6 weeks, it runs for this long. But what we're building long-term is far more interesting. And the fact that he paid us in trust with that idea made us feel so much more respected and so much truer to the idea. Like the idea was valued as much as any product that we would produce. And that is very exciting to me.
Yeah, that's an incredible example. And would audiences say, that's what I want to support too? I want to support knowing that this work is being done as well, if we ask them to. Talking about the big A audience. I know there's a lot of specifics we should get into about that. And I have questions about audience, but did anybody else want to chime in? Yeah.
I think my answer is going to be slightly askew in a way, because what I find the most inspiring is not yet, because I don't know, but not yet in the theater world, it's in the social justice world. And so organizations like Sustainable Economies Law Center, or, you know, or even the National Association of Solidarity Economy, and just checking out what people are up to and how far we're getting, and Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, and SIP culture, which is, everyone look up SIP culture. It'll blow your mind what Carlton Turner, who used to run, oh my goodness, sorry, my mind's not totally remembering anything. SIP culture, SIPP culture in a small town in Mississippi. It's really amazing what he's done. So what I'm finding, and have been since I ran the Foundry, I mean, one of the reasons we became so actively engaged with social justice communities was because they were just so far ahead of us. You know, the theater, I hate to say this, but I think probably most of my colleagues would agree, we are the last to get it, to get a revolution, so to speak, to get the actions of evolution. And we're pretty old-fashioned, no matter how progressive we are in what we make and how we think and how we work. We're really a lot of liberals mostly. And the radicalization, I think, that's taking place right in front of me, that I've been praying for 50 years, is very, very exciting. And so I do think that's my optimism. I do think that that shift in energetics, in political energetics in our community is bodes well. And I want to live long to see what happens. So.
Thank you. I'd love to ask about this idea of the public and community that has come up a few times, and how we're thinking about specifically the issue of access. I know it came up, Chris, a little bit around the edges of what you were talking about. And Eric, you talked a bit about access in your work. And that is, that seems to me to be the question, is how, if we want to look at institutions, is actually how institutions are defining their communities and what those communities are speaking up for. And as a quick example of this, I was very heartened to hear everyone talk about the brass tacks of a living wage. I did an event actually for, maybe I shouldn't say for which institution, but for an institution that titled the event, "The Show Must Go On." And it was meant to talk about reopening, and all of the artists that they had invited wanted to talk about accessing benefits. And it actually turned into an info session for the artists, which was supposed to be about artists talking about how they couldn't wait to go back. So we see this kind of perspective switch that has to happen, or else there will not be artists, as we know, in New York. So my question is really about how you're thinking, how people's idea of access is changing. It feels as though it can't be the same way that we've been defining it. We, meaning the many theaters have tended to define access. What are the thoughts about space and access and community right now? Where are our, whatever community you might think of yourself as a part, what is for you, what needs to happen in terms of how we think about access to your art, the arts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just quickly expand upon, and I will name this friend, Emma Sue Harris. They're on TikTok. If you like theater TikTok, you should follow them. But this is their idea that theater should be like libraries. And I think that's a beautiful image. I can just kind of set that up and I don't have to talk too long, because we all know what it's like to have a library in your local community. You don't have to charge anything to get in. You know, there's a wealth of resources there. Nobody's really like, I'm not like getting on the train and going, I mean, ideally, I don't have to get on a train and go like a 45-minute train. There's a library in my community. So it's truly, and all kinds of interesting events go on in the library that draw the community together, right? So compare that to your favorite, you know, off-Broadway theater. I'm thinking of one in particular right now. And it has a restaurant in it, you know, that yeah, I've done shows at this thing that I'm thinking of in my head right now. And, you know, it's like, I'm getting paid after taxes, after my agent takes the cut, after my union takes the cut. And wafting out of, at the end of the day of a rehearsal, is the smell of a cheeseburger that costs like $20, you know, and a beer that costs $12. And it's like, well, I'd love to have a burger and a beer, but I don't have $32 plus tax and tip when you know what I mean? So this is, I think access has to, you know, it's like, you know if you have it or not. It's just like power. I think if we're being frank, like you kind of know these things. And I think we should look to, just as I think I agree with Melanie, social justice organizations and movements are quite inspiring. I think we can also look to, you know, existing public infrastructure as to how we can pivot our arts institutions.
So I've been, you know, going around the world the last few years talking about the virtues of libraries. So I'm, you know, you spelled it out perfectly, and it's a great symbol. And let's, I mean, we're going to wrap up soon, but I think we should, you know, pay attention to the fact that we have these things called libraries. It's an amazing thing. And so what I often ask people to do is to like imagine that the library did not exist. Imagine there was no such thing as a library. And we all got together today and we pitched this idea, and we decided at the end of the day, we're going to go to the White House or, you know, the governor and say, we've come up with the idea. We would like to build a building in every city in the country. Some of them will be really grand. They'll have marble lions in front of it. And some, you know, some will be skyscrapers in downtown Los Angeles. We want to have branch libraries in every neighborhood, in every suburb, in every small town. We want to fill these libraries with all of our cultural heritage, you know, with books, with music, with plays, with video. We're going to have machines that people can use. We're going to put comfortable furniture in it. We'll open it 6-7 days a week. We will staff them with these magical people we call librarians, who will be public sector employees, you know, who will have a living wage. They will be open to everyone, regardless of their race or their class or their gender, even their immigration and status, their citizenship status. They can come in and they can take stuff out, and we'll just use an honor system to make sure they bring it back. You know, we'll give them a card. And if we pitch that to anyone today, I think probably maybe with the exception of Bernie Sanders, but maybe not, they would laugh us out of the room, because that's the most radical idea that's ever been pitched in the history of skirball. You know, no one's ever pitched an idea that radical, that we would build a whole thing like that. And the incredible thing is that here we are in the most capitalist country in the history of the world, right? With the organized around this brutal market logic. And some point in our history, we did that. We created that. The most radical thing you can imagine is a real part of our lives. It's an institution that we've inherited, and it's our responsibility to take care of it. And battle one is to make sure that we continue to have libraries. England right now, they're closing down libraries. They're relying on volunteer labor. They're selling them off for condo developments. I mean, it's a fight for survival in the library world. But what you're saying, which I am ready to sign up for and march for, is what if that library became the model for how we build out across cultural institutions, right? The theater is a library, the concert hall is a library. And I'll stop in 1 second. The thing to know is that in a previous moment like this, you know, when we put together the New Deal, we didn't just build bridges and tunnels and roadways, which is how it's often celebrated. We built places, we built cultural institutions, we supported artists, we supported performance writers of all kinds, because it's not free. It's something we pay ourselves collectively to do this work. And the payment of that collectively is the way in which we take care of each other. And we've gotten so accustomed to the idea that we will just pay into a thing that will go to the Halliburtons of the world. It's like we don't see the possibility that you're naming. And so I hope you name it even louder.
I want to just share with you what I learned when I first visited Brazil, which is why I've gone back as many times as I could ever afford to. Theaters, very few theater companies in Brazil have their own space. Almost none. In Rio and Sao Paulo, which is where I've spent all my time, I only found two theater companies, one in Rio, one in Sao Paulo, that had their own space. What the tradition of production is that there are these theaters all over the city that are part of much larger things. Some of them are owned by some of them are run by unions, by giant unions of workers. Both I don't know I can't remember what the categories were, where there's a swimming pool there, and there's education opportunities, language learning skills, all sorts of different things happening in this complex of gathering people. And theaters are within those gathering places. And no theater has to be branded. No theater has to, well, at this theater, this is the kind of work we do. There's lots of different work that goes in there, and companies can decide what space best fits, because they're all different. They're not all a model. They're all different structures, very different structures, small, large, in the round, outside, all kinds of different things. So when you're working on something, you can say, oh, you know, when it starts to actually be something you can look at or see, you can say, oh, I want to do this in this kind of space. It's there. You don't have to rejigger your own. And the other really great thing about it is there's no branding of, like, there's no ownership of a property, which also means there's no incredible pressure to meet the damn cost of owning a building. So people's budgets, theaters' budgets, they don't have to, which was the same with the Foundry. We never wanted a space from day one, never. We were twice offered and turned it down. I never wanted to have to worry about that. And I took that from Brazil, I have to say. So it's possible. It happens already.
Theater and real estate was actually my next question. Do we have time for a next question? I can't totally see if we need to. Oh, one more question. If anybody in the audience has a question, it can be your question. No. Okay. So this was my next question, was actually about where we see theaters making sustainable change. And the way that we often think about that is, at least in theater history, oh, the theater didn't have its own space. And so then after a few years, you know, and now we don't think about it. And so we often think about that change as being able to be sustainable once the theater owns its building, et cetera, et cetera. And it feels, Melanie, like you just shot that down. So thank you. But I am curious about how we're thinking about our experiences with theater and performance and reopening, and who has space where, especially when we think about the neighborhoods of New York. And the description, so I wanted to bring it up, the description of this event mentioned, that we are in the middle of elections, mayoral, just finished city council. So are there thoughts too, I mean, again, this kind of came up around the edges, but are there thoughts too about how we reopen and also redefine the way artists engage with their community in terms of politics? There's so much of people looking towards their elected officials. Can I get a grant for this? Are they going to write me in their line item? But, all of this stuff. Are there ways in which that can change, or that you've been seeing that change? And real estate is what made it come to my mind. But there are all different ways in which artists are or are not actually a part of participatory democracy in the city. So that is my question. If anybody has any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
I feel like I am less qualified to speak to this than some of the people I've worked with, but again, I'll mention there was part of some members of Actors Equity a few years ago formed a separate group outside of the auspices of the union proper, called Fair Wage on Stage. And we were negotiating particularly for the off-Broadway contract. And we met with city council members. We met with Gail Brewer at the time. And we talked about how theater was a $1 billion industry and how it behooved the local government to see us as partners and restructuring finances so that workers could be more fairly compensated. Because what we would hear from the institutions was, we don't have enough funding. But you see like money being spent on beautiful lobbies, you see money being spent on beautiful set pieces. And if you took a fraction of that cost and applied it to the bodies in the space, the benefit to us would be huge. And so it was a way to listen to the general managers of the theaters in part and say, okay, well, how can we partner with the city to make sure that we can be equitable in how we pay workers, and also make sure that the theaters have what they need to pay real estate or fees or whatever it is, finding the obstacles. And of course it didn't get solved, like we got a substantial wage increase, but it's still, we have a long way to go. And so this is an ongoing project. And, there are some people from Fair Wage on Stage that did join Actors Equity and got involved in committees. And there's work being done, but I think still there's a perception that our union doesn't do anything. Our union is inactive, and I think there's a problem with messaging on that front and getting folks involved, especially the people who have grievances to I think there needs to be more communication, union leadership talking to the members engaging actively with the union. That's a whole other conversation, but from my little vantage point, I saw some engagement with local officials, and it just felt like there was a lot more opportunity there.
Yeah, you can shut down a panel really quick. I've noticed if you go and it's like a panel of people running for office and you ask about the arts, so often they have very little to say unless they've actually sat and engaged in the way that you're describing that particular one did. Did you want to chime in, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say like everything is political.
Yeah.
Like we're not gonna be able to like turn theaters into libraries without understanding how like all of this is connected to our political economy. And the union thing is really interesting because our actors equity is in really, I think it's in bad shape. But the thing that I think people really notice is, like, if you remember, like, we are the union. And if you're not in a union, like, you join it, it's not really enough to complain about it. You have to kind of like build a dual power structure. Like, one of the folks who was on the Fair Wage on Stage, like Slate, and could have been a high ranking kind of person, was kind of pushed out by the old guard because they just didn't want that energy. So, the struggle is like constantly ongoing, not just, you think maybe the union would be the place to do it. I think like healthcare, there's a group called AEA for single payer, who's like trying to get the union to like full-throatedly support that. And it's good, like I was talking to somebody who works for a smaller theater, and they were like, we put all this money into the union. I mean, yeah, we give this money over to your health fund that you might not ever see. Little small, interesting, horrible thing that basically my health insurance and my union is kind of like a Ponzi scheme. So they're saying, we give all this money to the union for your health insurance, you might not ever see it. If we got single payer, that same amount of money can go straight to you without having to even like change the budget of the theater, right? And it's the same with like something like if we saw housing as a human right and we all organized around that, and we got more like affordable and rent controlled living situation for not just arts workers, for everyone. Again, the pay that comes from an institution actually doesn't have to change. That money will go further when my rent is now reduced by 50%, when my health insurance is now given to me by the state. So it's like really incumbent upon all of us to actually get super political so we can understand how these things are not like the problem of this one theater, the problem of this one industry, but it actually is like all of it all at once. But the great thing about it, that means then all of us can work together and do something about it. And there's a lot more of us than there are the people who like want to keep our health insurance from us. So like it's great. It's great when you think that way.
That's awesome. That's actually a great note to end on. I always see these conversations as really like part of that work, Chris. So that's why I get it. That's why it makes me excited to imagine kind of like continue using these ideas to continue to build. So this has been a joy. Thank you, everybody. And especially thank you to the Skirball. And I'm excited for the next panel as well. So thanks to all.
As Brandon said, I'm a lawyer and a law clerk, so I have to do some quick disclaimers before I give any opinions, unfortunately. So first disclaimer is that all these opinions are my own. They're not the views of the court or of the judge. He has expressed that he is free to have different opinions, and he is very free to disagree with anything that I say. So that's first disclaimer. And second disclaimer is that I am just going to be discussing pretty general laws that apply to the industry. I'm not opining about any case in controversy, and I'm not providing any legal advice. So just had to get those out of the way. So a little bit about my background. I studied opera in undergrad. I moved to the city, thought I would audition for a little while. And quickly decided that that's not what I wanted to do. And so I applied to law school. And once I was in law school, I decided to focus my second year research on really how it could be legal for what I viewed as an entire subset of the theater industry to be subsisting on free or virtually free labor. And so that is what I focused on. And so I'm just going to change this a little bit. Okay. And so as a result of that, I produced a note that I published, and I'm going to just discuss some of the legal frameworks that apply to the industry that I analyzed in that piece of academic work. And so what I found was that there are a lot of gray areas in the law that actually may operate to perpetuate some of these unfair labor practices that we see and make it more challenging and present more barriers for workers and actors and artists to actually understanding their rights to legal and fair pay. So I'm just going to discuss a little bit of that framework first. So we have the federal minimum wage law that is part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so that sets the floor, not the ceiling. So if you are covered by federal minimum wage law, you're likely also covered by state minimum wage law, which is usually more than the $7.25 an hour. Why it's a little bit confusing is because the Fair Labor Standards Act federal minimum wage law applies to employees in certain businesses. And that seems straightforward, but this is one of the first gray areas that I think a lot of industry participants, actors, stage managers, artists, performers fall into being misclassified as some sort of contractor. And so that's the first gray area in the law that, you know, allows employees to be misclassified by their employers as contractors. And so the way that we analyze whether someone's an employee or an independent contractor and therefore do compensation under minimum wage laws is by applying what's called the economic reality test. And these are all, one of the challenges is that these are all ex post facto retroactive tests after the employment has already happened. And that's unfortunate. And so one of the aims of, you know, making sure that actors and artists are paid fairly is from the very beginning. I think some of the other panelists also spoke about this, getting transparency. What are the wages going to be? Am I an employee and am I an independent contractor? So that we can avoid these retroactive examinations of the employment relationship. So we have this economic reality test. This is again to identify whether someone's a contractor, whether a performer is a contractor, or whether they are an employee. And the test is going to look at a sliding scale of control, who's in control of the performance. And then they're also going to look at, and by they, I mean departments of labor or courts, they're going to look at whether the artist has any share of the profits of the theater. And so there are so many different factual situations. It's hard to just think of one type of situation, but I guess the situation I have in mind that I was really focused on in my research was non-union actors and stage managers. And so when you apply this economic reality test, you're looking at, are their rehearsal hours set? Are they having any specific wardrobe? Are they told, you know, are they directed? Is there a choreographer telling them how much creativity to use in certain situations? And so my conclusion, based on just these general factual scenarios, was that it was likely that most non-union actors performing in contracts, you know, across the country would be considered employees and therefore should be getting a minimum wage. The pushback from the courts that we see is, or from employers or from the people hiring these laborers, is that, oh, you know, these are short contracts. They're really just in and out. They're not employees. They're really independent contractors, and therefore we can pay them what we agree on through contract. And even though the courts haven't analyzed this specific situation, they have in other cases involving cheerleaders and exotic dancers, actually, they've said that that is not really the most important factor in the analysis. And so we don't really have a clear answer from the law on whether whether artists, performing artists, stage managers, actors, whether they would be considered employees or independent contractors, but the weight of the law that seems to be analogous would suggest that they are employees. So how could we make this clearer? The law tends to stay away from bright line rules, but this could be a situation where a bright line rule would be really useful to shift the power back to the employee and really make it clear that these people are employees. So how could we do this? And again, these are maybe more lofty aspirations in terms of changing the law, changing state law, changing federal law to include, which they do actually in workers' compensation law in New York, to include in the definition of employee performing artists. So that there's no question that performing artists are employees. Now, we don't like bright line rules because sometimes they're over inclusive. And so we could instead do something like have a rebuttable presumption, which would mean that the assumption is that these people are employees. And if the employer wants to bring forth facts that suggest otherwise, they're more than welcome to. But we will have the power balance shifted toward the employee so that hopefully we can start to equalize the balance of power. Okay, so that's one gray area. I'm not sure when I started, but I think I still have a few minutes. The other gray area, maybe not so much a gray area, but there's really an enforcement issue here. Who is enforcing labor laws? It could come from various departments of labor. It could come from actors themselves, but that's not really realistic to expect people to bring individual claims, individual lawsuits on their own, paying for an attorney, litigating in court for maybe years, to eventually get a ruling that says that they are due back wages of maybe a few $1,000s. Not really realistic. So, you know, as people in the previous panel have discussed, one of the best ways would be to have transparency right up front, negotiating your wages, making it known that you know what you're legally entitled to, so that you can avoid any illegal pay issues. Another suggestion that I heard from someone that I think would be really amazing, and some other countries do this, would be to have within the departments of labor, some departments of cultural performing bureau that would be enforcing these specific things, especially in a state like New York, in a city like New York, where theater is everywhere. And so that's another option. And then quickly, just to tie these labor issues into the other side of the panel, which is equity, I think it's good to remember that just because wages are legal doesn't mean that they're equitable. And so I think that what we've heard from this other panel is we're shifting away during COVID. We've really seen the disparity between legal minimum wage and livable wage and what that means. And so I think that the discussion is already shifting away from pay me minimum wage to pay me fair wage, pay me an equitable wage. And I think that that's the direction that we should keep going in. But we also need to remember that there still are industry participants out there that are not even making minimum wage, which is probably illegal. So how do we target those issues, not leaving those people behind while also pushing forward for livable, equitable, fair wages? So those, I think, are the challenges that we will have to see going forward. And maybe we can make changes to the law that will get rid of some of these questionable practices. So yeah. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jimena Garnica. Thank you so much for this invitation and for sharing a space and time and reflections together. I use pronouns she, her. I am a choreographer, a director, a multidisciplinary and an interdisciplinary artist, and also an immigrant from the country currently named Colombia and a citizen of the country currently named the United States of America. I am the co-director of LeMay, an arts entanglement and organism, and also a performance ensemble based in Brooklyn. I am the co-founder of the Cultural Solidarity Fund, which was a fund that unfortunately had to be formed in response to the financial emergencies faced by arts and cultural workers during this pandemic. So far, the Cultural Solidarity Fund has given over $500,000 to 1,116 art workers who are facing housing insecurity, food insecurity, and other financial challenges. We still have 1,600 more people in our waiting list to give more money. So please check out the fund. And early this year, I was one of the many cultural organizers alongside Melody Capote from the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute, who came together to organize the Decentralized Arts Workers Rally, which demanded relief funding directly to the arts workers, the creation of a substantial jobs program, and called for a complete overhaul of the funding system of our city. I have to acknowledge that today I am struggling to talk about labor equity because my reflections in these presentations are in the context of labor equity within the capitalism system and in relationship to institutions functioning within that system. Those powers have a strong presence in my life, And yet I refuse to situate my work only in relationship to those powers. How to carry on artistic work outside of the mechanisms imposed by these powers, and yet how I can develop an ability to affect those powers. Is there a possibility for my work to exist outside the frameworks of labor, or perhaps do I constantly shift my definitions of labor? Those are personal questions that I always have, but they resonate when I read the title of the of today's evening. And one thing I say for sure is that I personally reject to live a life without poetry. But that doesn't mean that so part of me doesn't want to spend my energy centering institutions, and yet I also know that people working together, we can be huge powers for transformation at the policy level, which will then affect our work and our well-being, like Chris was saying in an earlier panel. So for me, it's hard to ignore that the fact that I'm personally struggling to sustain my own practice and a performance ensemble through our current structure of a small budget art organization. I haven't been able to always pay proper wages to myself or to my collaborators. And even though I have managed to sustain a practice by constantly imagining and reimagining ways in which circulate resources, our financial stability is still precarious. For 5 years, we worried about being evicted of our live work space of over 20 years. And to have a home and a space to work has been instrumental in developing our capacity as an artist, as humans. If without that live work space, we wouldn't have developed the community that we have right now. So we organized, we worked for 5 years to change the law, and now we managed to save our home studio, which is amazing for us. But the fact is that thousands of our workers today are facing housing and food insecurity and medical, child, and elder care emergencies, and that the lion's share of our workers has no safety net, and they are not even associated with any art institution. So the prompt I was giving today does center the institutions, and we are housed here by one today. So I am going to tunnel vision in order to follow the prompt that I was given, which is, what do you believe are some of the more pressing questions of labor and equity that institutions should be addressing at the moment? I have so many pressing questions that I think institutions should be addressing. Many of the questions I will share today are not solely mine. They were gathered from reflections and discussions of many artists and groups in the field who are currently creating communities of reflections and who are facing the devastating conditions of our workers as we transform our own practices and structures. I want to give a shout out here to like the people for creating creative new cultures and creative new futures. I'm sorry, Dance NYC, the same group of the Cultural Solidarity Fund, podcasts like the Dance Union, the podcast of Miguel Gutierrez. There's so much community like reflection happening in different pockets of our city, which I think is tremendous and positive. But I do want to say that the funding landscape of our country is bleak and is the backdrop of our labor structures. So the government support, and most of you know these things, but I do think that we need to repeat it for each other because it's crazy that the United States has such a minimal money for the arts. And for example, President Biden gave for the 2022 arts budgets for the NEA is $201 million. But in contrast, the United States spends $778 billion on national defense in 2020. So it's really like, it's huge. We're talking about 200 million versus billions of dollars. And then if we look closer to home here in New York City, our arts budget could also use some increases, especially as 80% of the budget is already secured by the Cultural Institutional Group. This is a group of 34 institutions in the city who regularly receive 80% of the budget of the whole city, while over 1,200 small and mid-sized organizations compete for the rest. You know what I'm talking about, the Hunger Games. And this doesn't count the individual artist who doesn't even have the opportunity to access those funds. So I quote Melody Capote here. She say, I am not opposed to CIG funding. I am opposed to the criteria created for CIG funding eligibility. The city gives valuable real estate to predominantly white institutions, and in exchange for their willingness to preserve Eurocentric values, they get priority funding to maintain the status quo, close quote. Then I have to look at our philanthropy system, private foundation, ensuring the conservation of private wealth, trapped in values of meritocracy with unjust granting mechanisms, lack of transparency, and limited resources. And lastly, are our institutions that have mostly emerged from and uphold white supremacist values and their colonial continuation, and they are the main formal employers of our workers. These are institutions are the ones who establish and normalize certain often inequitable labor practices. So here are some questions. I do think they're all really pressing and urgent that we can ask and institutions can ask. Does your institution needs to exist? Is your institution existent mainly to keep standing as a shell that gets animated by a few overseas globally recognized art workers and a selected few locals? Is your institution mostly serving the wealthy and the tourists? Now, if you say, yes, my institution is still relevant and it still needs to exist, then is your institution actually centering the artists? Is your institution centering the artist as a worker? Is your institution centering the artist as a person and as a human? Is your institution compensated their workers' labor? Has your institution performed a pay equity audit? Where were the results? What are you doing to remediate inequalities? What benefits are you providing to your team members? What is the budget that you have set aside for artist compensation, and what is in relationship to your administrative, production, operating budget? Does this ratio seems like it centers artist labor? Are you engaged in institutional transparency? Is your institution working from the place of care or scarcity? Because when we care, we are concerned for others. Scarcity makes us competitive, afraid, and just. How are you taking care of our workers who are parents? Does your institution leadership, staff, and board reflect the demographics of the local community? I was reading the People Cultural Plans, and it says that in New York City, 67% of the population identify as people of color, and just 33% identifies as white. Yet, staff of nonprofit cultural institution is 62% white, 74% of leadership staff is white, and board members are 78% white. Is your institution improving recruitment and retention of trans and gender non-conforming staff and board members? What is your connection to indigenous people besides your land acknowledgement statement? Do you make a space for your staff and workers to show up as people, as individuals? Is there an ethos of humanity and culture of caring for the human first and the organization needs second? Does the laborer feel valued, heard, seen? Who owns the institution? What kind of contracts are you asking to us, to your workers to sign? Do you involve our workers in the hiring process to determine if they are to perform duties as employers or independent contractors, depending on the scope of their work and the state laws? Do you compensate artists for negotiation of time? Do you compensate artists for cancellation? Is your institution engaged in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion processes, or is your institution involved in decolonizing processes? Because the first one often leads to checking some marks in the boxes, such as hiring a few staff members of colors, or have a white affinity group, or reading the book about white fragility. But the second is inclusive of all of that, but it's even more complex and is intersectional. Are you applying an intersectional approach towards understanding system of oppressions that appear in your programmatic, administrative, and leadership structures? Do you have indigenous leaders in your organization? Do you hire indigenous artists? What process does your institution have in place to check if harmfully perpetuating white supremacist values by insisting in their colonial continuity? Is your institution actively advocating for increased funding for the arts at the federal, state, and city levels? Is your institution aware that the trickle-down funding leaves art workers last? New York artists have been undervalued and undercompensating for so long time, and many are still suffering from over a year of devastating neglect. Moreover, only a percentage of artists in the city have institutional support. Many are not even hired by the institutional gatekeepers and tastemakers. Who make these hires? Remember, mostly white folks with certain aesthetics and cultural values are in decision-making positions. So who gets hired and by whom? Our workers imagine, build, and transform community. We wrote this together for the Arts Rally. Art Center culture, Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled, deaf, immigrants, elders, women, LGBTQIA+, and independent artist workers must be at the center of New York City culture to achieve equity, not just labor equity, but also racial equity and funding equity. Centering artists must be at the center of our cultural institutions, but also as artists, how we keep organizing, how we keep creating our own organization. Overhauling the arts labor system is tied to arts funding system and is tied to institutional reimagining, but this overhauling will require bold and radical imagination. It will require artists, art workers, leaders, community members, government representatives, institutions, and advocates to come together to restructure the current institutional practices and funding mechanisms. It will require lots of self-checking and community accountability. Even as a leader of a small, mostly volunteer-run organization, I myself reckon with all these questions and embrace this era as an ongoing process of intentional transformation. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. So first, let me thank NYU for having me here. My name's Adam Krauthammer. I'm the president of the Musicians Union here in New York City. I want to thank the other panelists. It's as the labor leader, and I was asked to sort of speak about what it's been like for organized labor from the start of the pandemic through what has been a really brutal 18 or 19 months to this reset and reopening. I've found everybody's contribution so far to be rewarding. It's not often that I hear everything from the independent contractor legal issue to workers' power and organizing and philosophical discussion about culture and what it can and should be in the United States. So just a little background on myself, just so there's some context. I grew up here in New York. I went to the Curtis Institute of Music and then Yale for graduate school. I play the French horn. I'm a professional musician. I was working for about 16 years professionally, and through union activism and organizing and an election, became president of the Musicians Union. And we have 7,000 members here in New York City who are union members that work everywhere from the Village Vanguard, the Apollo, Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, all of Broadway, to the Stone, where John Zorn is. And I've had the honor and pleasure of being their voice at a really unique time, but also really hard time. And I want to focus on sort of three pieces through the pandemic: culture, power, and the union. And just to give people an understanding from sort of my seat, what that was like for many professional musicians here in New York. And, not to forget the fact that it is our primary goal to figure out how to represent all musicians in New York. That unfortunately, in a complicated industry, in a complicated world, many people don't even have the protections of union agreements. And, if there's anything the pandemic taught us, is that those agreements and what a labor union does, which is use the philosophy of collective power, collective action to create better wages, better working conditions. There was a lot of discussion around health and safety. Coming out of this pandemic, it's now more important than ever to look beyond not just my membership, but to all of the musicians in the city. At the outset of the pandemic, virtually within 5 days, our entire industry closed. We had 100% unemployment within 1 week. We saw, in terms of being able to support our musicians, we saw our revenue drop by 95%. Somebody talked about shared resources before, which is something that I always tell people is important when you're part of a union and you join. We share resources, but it was pretty scary that we were facing having no resources at the toughest possible time. And what that looked like for me, as I was used to organizing and negotiating contracts and everything, was first having the reality come that we were going to have to renegotiate hundreds of the contracts that we held to shut them down, which is obviously depressing, but not your standard negotiation. and nobody knew for how long. And simultaneously, as it became clear that we were going to have all of these concessionary negotiations, two things became clear. One was that unfortunately, our industry was going to be disproportionately affected. The nature of what we do, live performance, conflicts with COVID. Getting people together in small groups, medium-sized groups, or large groups was simply unrealistic. And we started to understand that this was going to go on for quite a while. And our community, not just in the union, but community of artists here in New York, whether they are musicians or painters or stagehands or makeup artists or dancers, were really going to suffer. And as we move forward to realize how long this was going to be, I immediately realized the importance of sort of having a public message and a public discussion about our survival. And it's funny hearing about the independent contractor issue, which is something musicians have, we own the gig economy. We started that, unfortunately, many, many decades ago because of the laws, and misclassification has always been an issue. And one of the immediate issues at the beginning of the pandemic we dealt with was building our political relationships. And we had some, but we needed to build more, and making very clear, especially at the federal level, and we have a good relationship with Senator Schumer, to make clear that even an aid package wasn't good enough. We needed an aid package with an enhanced unemployment for artists. And we needed that aid package to cover gig workers and 1099 workers, as this was going to go on for a long period of time. That's sort of an example of sort of the emergency up front that we saw. 6 months later, after virtually negotiating the settlement shutdown of most of our agreements, I wrote an op-ed that ran in the New York Daily News, and it was called "We Must Avoid a Great Cultural Depression." And I don't think it's like the usual standard operating procedure for union leaders to be focusing on that, but I saw the long-term issue coming, and it affects all of us. And my concern after 6 months was that this would not only go on for a while, but the response was inadequate for the arts community here in New York and across the country. And that we were at risk of permanent damage if things didn't change. Some of the great ideas you heard about today were some of the things that I wrote about in the op-ed, which is a greater focus from the government on funding for the arts. That the original New Deal had millions and millions of dollars put in it specifically for jobs coming out of World War II. We asked and we're lobbying for the same. It was funny to hear about libraries. We had specific proposals about how important it was to try and find a way to do streamed live performance from everybody's main community hub, which should be their library. And, the question was asked, well, if this goes on for 2 years or 18 months now that it has, what does that really mean for the arts? What is it going to look like after? My members, many of them were moving away. They were going into different professions. They were selling their instruments. And this is organized labor. Most musicians, most artists, you don't go into the arts for a paycheck. You go into the arts because you deeply care about it and you're committed to it. Most artists live on the fringe in normal times, and we were in a pandemic. So I was deeply concerned about what the future would look like midway through. And I think it's, interesting example of something that I saw as we finally, about a year in, started to come out that speaks to some of the institutional problems and inability for some to understand the need. when we started talking with the now former governor, they wanted to propose a program of concerts around New York State. And I should say the disgraced former governor, along with disgraced former producer, I hope, Scott Rudin, came up with a program to relaunch the arts across New York State. And I'm lucky enough to be in a job where I communicate with the governor's office. And they came to us with the plan and they said, this is the plan. You've been telling us your people are not in good shape. We are going to do these things. We're really excited. And I asked, well, what are the details? To which they said, well, that's it. We're going to have these concerts. And I said, well, what are you going to pay people? Where is it going to be? I said, well, we didn't think about that part. You know, this is really exciting. Everybody needs to pitch in. And, you know, it's like you're either spending your life on Zoom these days, you know, staring into a screen or screaming through a phone, trying to get through to people. And I said to him, I said, guys, at least I'll speak for myself and a number of other union leaders were on this call. I have 7,000 members. There's no jobs, none. There are zero jobs. You're talking about the first few and you want them to be free. It's not right. That's the problem with the disconnect with the arts in this country. And if you look overseas in other countries in different parts of the world, there is a relationship between society and culture that is different. And it's supported institutionally by the government in most places. And, you know, the core thesis, I guess, of we must avoid a great cultural depression is the fact that I believe deeply that society is actually built on culture. It's not built on an investment bank. If you look at history from the beginning of time, that's why most of what we do is in museums. It's why it's studied. It's why it's encouraged to be taught to children. But yet in the United States, for a number of decades, we've become totally disengaged from this. And it's part of the reason that there is a gap, a lack of understanding, a lack of respect, which is what you heard on the stage a lot from many of the performers themselves and through their institutions, that artists need to survive to make their art. They're not volunteering. They have to eat. They have to pay rent, let alone be compensated properly for what they actually do. And we've disengaged from that. And I'm focused on coming out of the pandemic to ensure that our officials, that not-for-profits, which far too often are run top-down, whose administrations are paid millions upon millions of dollars, and the artists themselves receive next to nothing, have to start understanding. You know, it's, you go into, there's an inability but willingness argument. It was interesting to hear about the Fair Wage on Stage campaign, which we ran a similar campaign off Broadway with a lot of very good people in the not-for-profit sector. And we made similar headway, but I remember having this discussion. You know, it's, we love the public theater. You guys just got money from the city for a $20 million bathroom renovation. Bathroom looks great. I don't think you asked the plumber to take a 50% cut because it's a not-for-profit. But yet my musicians come in and you're not even offering them the few $100s a week, let alone healthcare, that they need to survive. And the people who sit on these boards, I respect, and we need them. They're the ones who are supporting the arts in this country. And there's this disconnect of liberal thought. Like, I am liberal, I support social justice, I vote for Democrats, the whole thing, except when it comes to the arts and workers, except when it comes to unions and unionizing. And it's what this country was built on. So coming out of the pandemic, there's some successes. There's the example of the American Rescue Plan, which frankly, the Democrats thankfully got through reconciliation. That saved a number of pension funds, which, you know, artists don't often get to talk about retirement, but we should because we deserve it. It helped fund COBRA subsidies at 100%. It helped with childcare. It helped with a number of other things. So that's an example of some success, but to a certain degree. And the scarier part is as we reemerge from the pandemic, I see what many of my colleagues up here see is that to reemerge, they wanted permanent concessions. They wanted things to permanently be changed in our contract, which frankly changes culture permanently. And the other thing is that they want everybody to just go back to normal, like nothing happened. And the reality is we need to start thinking in the arts about collective action and collective power. And it's easy for me to say as a union leader that that's what we should be thinking about and doing. Unions have plenty of flaws. I ran for office to examine many of those flaws, but I think that there's an ideal that we could all agree about in this room that power, respect, political power, all of that is essential to protect artists. And if there's a question everybody should ask themselves coming out of the pandemic is, how do we better preserve culture and the connection between culture and society? And to me, it directly relates to supporting and protecting artists, which flows through our collective power, which is there. And you saw it on the stage with some of these panel members who are actively engaged in it. And that's the optimistic Adam part of this speech as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Ruth Milkman. I teach at CUNY at the Graduate Center in the School of Labor and Urban Studies, and I'm not a theater person except as a consumer. I do attend theater whenever I get a chance, but I'm a labor sociologist, and I'm going to build on some of what Adam just talked about in terms of the role of unions. But I want to start.
A little closer to the microphone.
Make it closer?
Yes, just pull it closer.
Is that better? Sorry. Okay, so I think we all know this. Reopening presents new risks and new opportunities, and a crisis like the pandemic that we're still living through also has both those sides. Obviously it's a crisis. It has been disastrous for performing arts in all the ways we've discussed so far, but it opens up the possibility of lasting change. I can't agree more with what Adam said, that the default is to go back to how things were. And there's a lot of pressure in that direction, not just in terms of power and money, but also, people are nostalgic for how things were, people in general, right? So that's like the risk. But I think this is a moment of opportunity as well. So having said that, I want to just say a little bit more about the sort of bigger landscape of labor in the performing arts, and especially the role of unions. At the School of Labor and Urban Studies, we put out an annual study called The State of the Unions that sort of documents trends in the New York City, state, and national labor movement. And as those reports have shown repeatedly, New York City is actually much more unionized than the rest of the United States, though not the rest of the world, I might add. It's roughly union density, which means just the percentage of workers who are unionized, is about double the national level here in the city. In the performing arts, and of course, especially on Broadway, it's higher than that, although it's very hard to get precise numbers because for the reasons that have already been mentioned, that most performing artists are the original gig workers, right? And therefore are not necessarily continuously employed. And so it's very hard to get accurate statistics. What we do know is that the performing arts labor force is highly educated, relatively young, especially compared to audiences in an age when it costs so much money to see live performances. But most, as you've heard from many speakers already, have low incomes, problems of access to health coverage, other benefits, affordable housing, even food. The work of performing arts is the prototypical labor of love. This is irregular, insecure, precarious work for the majority. Obviously for superstars, that's not the case, but they are few and far between. People work incredibly long hours when they do have work and also face long spells of unemployment. I'm talking pre-pandemic. So it's sort of feast or famine. Performing arts unions have been around for quite a long time and have tried to address these problems through what's sometimes called the craft union model. In a way, performing artists are like construction workers. They work on a job, the building is finished, they find a new job. They work in a show, the show closes. They may not work in between, same with construction workers. So it's a different model than, say, a factory union, where as long as the factory is open, you know, you're under a contract and the terms and benefits are set. It's constantly shifting. And that's why performing arts unions have portable benefits. You pay into the union manages your health care if you have it, and your pension, not the employer. And so that makes a lot of sense. This may all seem like part of the problem or part of the old-fashioned institutional structure, and it is. But I myself believe it's crucial to defend unions as institutions at the same time as we struggle to transform them into more progressive, more radical, if you will, institutions. And I think activities like the campaign we heard about in the first panel, the Fair Wage on Stage, is a perfect example of, you know, how to have it both ways. Unions, after all, are the folks who brought you the weekend and all of that. I mean, that's a cliche, but it's true. Okay, so although performing arts here in New York are highly unionized, there's tremendous pressure from employers, as we've already heard today, reflecting the rising cost of space, declining public subsidies, graying audiences, I'm a case in point, as well as the broader corporate neoliberal culture that is extremely hostile to workers. And above all, as has already been said, the lack of adequate public support for the arts, which is not a utopian fantasy in many parts of the world that exists. And it's even existed in this country in some periods of time in the past. The last State of the Unions report, what I already mentioned that we did, we looked at the impact of the pandemic on job losses, and we found that in general, in New York and nationally, unionized workers were less likely to lose their jobs in the pandemic, mostly because, you know, they had some protection from the union. Obviously, that was not the case in the performing arts, as Adam already explained. Basically, everything closed. Well, you all know that. There was some relief from public sources, COBRA subsidies, extended unemployment, payroll protection loans, Save Our Stage funds, et cetera. Still, the longstanding problems that were already there before of underemployment, unemployment, access to benefits were exacerbated for lots and lots of people. And even as things begin to reopen, so far, attendance is spotty, tourists aren't here, et cetera. So those pressures remain. But again, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a moment of risk as well as opportunity. It's a chance to address the longstanding problems in the sector and try to reopen on a better, stronger basis, embodying the kind of vision that we heard in the first panel of, you know, lifting up the needs of workers and making sure that they're met. For me, it was very exciting to see it has been very exciting to see the proliferation starting before the pandemic, but now in the stuff that's on offer in theater here in the city today, exposing the voices of people of color and especially African Americans. I was also very delighted to learn about the new deal for Broadway announced a couple months ago by the theater owners and signed on to by most unions as well, aimed at improving racial equity, trying to eliminate all white creative teams, diversity training, and so on. And we all know that the Me Too movement has raised awareness and actually had some positive practical effects too in the industry in regard to gender equity, though talking the talk in both cases is much easier than walking the walk, so we'll see. But I think sometimes, you know, in my world of academia, there's a lot of interest in intersectionality, race, class, and gender is kind of the holy trinity. And what I've noticed over and over again is that the class piece gets the least attention. And I mean, thankfully, this program today is not like that. That's what it's all about. But I think we have to struggle to make sure that remains the case. It is happening here and there. And I think the pandemic has exposed for all to see the, vast inequities in this country between employers and workers, labor and capital, if you will. And we're starting to see in some industries, including the restaurant industry, which I know employs a lot of performing artists as well, some promising efforts to try to upgrade wages and conditions, eliminating tipping and so on. But, we need to go way beyond that. I think in restaurants, for example, and some other industries, the shortages of labor put pressure on employers to do something about it. Performing arts is kind of the opposite, even with all the people who've left the city and whatnot that Adam mentioned. There's a glut of labor. There always has been. So that kind of pressure isn't there. And the challenge is, as the industry reopens and the subsidies that the pandemic produced fade away, that jobs will be degraded rather than improved, and that employers will continue to demand concessions, as Adam already spoke about. There's been cooperation between management and labor on vaccine mandates, and I think a new public appreciation of all that was lost during the shutdowns. So I think, the question is, can that be the basis for progress on the kinds of issues that the previous speakers have outlined today that the industry faces? And I just want to echo what Chris Meyer said in the first panel. This is up to us. These things are the product of struggles between different social forces. This is a crisis. It's also an opportunity. And we just have to make sure that the default is not the old normal or even something worse. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those wonderful talks. It was so inspiring. So I think I just wanted to pick up on something that I heard a couple times reiterated in different ways throughout these talks, which is this unresolvable tension between, fighting for recognition within a system and dismantling that system. So I wanted to highlight and emphasize something that Jimena said. This frustration that I think is really crucial that I heard at the beginning of your talk, where you said, do I have to see my work, within the category of wage labor? Is that the only way that that my work can be recognized, that I can be recognized? So I think I just wanted to sort of, inflect that tension and ask anyone and all of you, whether such a reclassification of performing arts workers, as Shelley discussed, could also change how we think about labor in general. Like whether there's a way in which changing the way that we think about the labor of arts workers actually could transform our thinking about labor across the board.
It's related, but it's the resonance of what I got from your question and I was thinking. Of course, I'm going to talk about from the place of labor and dignify labor and being able to have a family and a roof over my head. I think one of the unveiling things that the relief funds did was that suddenly the independent artists were able to get access to the PPP loans, and a lot of my colleagues in the field were able to access those monies. That means they saw independent artists as businesses, as people who hire people, who circulate resources in an economy. As artists, like I think Melanie was saying very proudly, I never had a red budget. Like we never were like in red, like we managed for 20 something years. My theater, I feel similarly with our groups, like somehow we don't have so much to lose, so we cannot afford to be in red. So we manage somehow to make calculating risk, but we are agents of work, and we are also employees and employers, and we are not being seen that way. So for example, non-for-profits got totally excluded for the business relief package, we were not able to access that money. Foundations continue to infantilize artists and small artist-run theaters organizations, demanding that we have a budget over $250,000 in order to access capital. We could be putting money directly into our workers' hands as a small businesses, and we are not being seen that way. So why in my talk I focus so much about the funding system, it's because labor practices can change in the institutional and micro level, but actually most of the power is in the ground level with us artists, our workers, our ensembles, our theater companies, our small collectives. And how we manage to build these collective bubbles to be recognized as so, to break some of this arbitrary laws and foundations in government has, that they just existed there because somebody decided to put them there because they thought artists were going to get a grant for $2,000 and run away to the Caribbean. That's not what we do. You know, once you put money on us, it goes directly to buy food, to pay rent, or to purchase some materials that we create with. So I think the point here is like, yes, I agree. I also know artists that don't want to be they don't want to be salary employees, that they want to remain independent contractors. And is the solution that we all across the board are now salary employers? Or is there a way that we can see multiple scenarios in which artists who want to continue being independent can continue being independent and yet have a dignified labor, benefits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
I would just add that maybe what's more important than whether you're an employee legally or an independent contractor is what the terms of the bargain are. Is it possible to survive economically in this profession? And is the profession and its contribution to society valued sufficiently by the powers that be? I mean, that seems more important in a way. I think in other sectors, you see the same dichotomy where, like, you know, there've been all these struggles in California, especially about Uber and Lyft and those kinds of companies. Are they independent contractors? Are they employees? And they're divided, just as you're reporting on artists. That's really not the question. The question is, can you earn a living wage driving people around? So sometimes I think this stuff distracts us from the fundamental questions.
Could I turn that to Shelley? Actually, I mean, do you think I was really inspired by the pragmatism of that, that deceptively simple idea, that if performing arts workers were reclassed as employees, at least there would be a minimum wage guaranteed, which obviously, as we know, is something that many performers workers do not receive. I mean, but I wonder if you have a response to this idea that we've just heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the issue is that maybe some artists are not sure. They don't go into the negotiation thinking that they have the power. I'm talking about artists not backed by a union or, individually negotiating contracts who are like, I'm not sure of my legal rights here. And I think that empowering them, I mean, not that it's necessarily, not the onus is on them. It should be on theaters or employers or whoever they're contracting with to offer them a living fair wage. But if that's not happening, and it's not, how do we empower the individual people to know, I know legally I am this, or I know that or maybe we still have the choice to be a 1099 worker, but I know that I'm guaranteed this minimum wage. So I want to know how many hours I'm going to be working. I want to know, are you paying for my lodging? I want to know the breakdown of everything so that I can then come and say, great, I am legally entitled to $500 a week, and then ask for more, just to have more negotiating power, which I think is what we're not necessarily seeing on an individual level when you're just so excited you booked a contract and you're going to take whatever you can. So I think maybe just having the power of the law behind you could be a helpful support if you're not part of a union or if you're not otherwise ready to negotiate on your own.
Did anyone else want to answer that? I don't know. Okay, well, maybe just picking up on this conversation. I was also interested in the way that the issue of the gig, and which of course we hear so much today about the gig economy, and which obviously comes from music, right? It's originally, I wanted to invite anyone to comment on how you see the fights that are going on in performing arts labor issues reflected, or if you could compare or contrast them to other labor issues that are going on in the country.
No, because there is something lingering from the last one that I want to
Great.
say,
Sure,
because it's
sure.
the tension. And I think of the dismantling while we're actually trying to reimagine or imagining something. And it's like we're riding the horse, but we don't want that horse, but we're riding the horse. And we have to be very intentional on that. And I think especially my talk is to the artists, to the art workers, to really to don't be afraid to dwell, to really dwell right now. Like, this is the time where the solutions are not gonna come from outside. Like, we have to trust in what we do in our studios. We have to trust in what we do when we play that instrument, when we sing that song. We know that power, that energetic power. And I think if we just can together believe that we can use that power for transformation at the social level, at the policy level, then there's so much positive, amazing things that come to my mind. But if we can isolate, and it's just going to be very depressive for us all, and it's going to be like very apocalyptic view. And I want to choose the other one, the one of joy and resistance through joy, through our art. So yeah, but please, the next question.
Thank you.
No, I agree. We should avoid the apocalypse. And I agree. The complicated part on the last question is that the system has to change, but really, you have to keep going. So you have to keep working in the system. It's unrealistic to think that the system is just going to blow to pieces and then you pick it up. It's like changing an organization. You can't do it in a week. It just doesn't work that way. So I think all of us have a duty to sort of try and do both, right? There's a way, and that's like I know Chris was talking about systemic versus structural change. Those things don't happen that's not like a couple weeks, make everything happen. That's a couple years, if not a couple decades. And I think part of at least in my mind, my own constitution is that you work the system you have and try and improve that system to the best of your ability and build your power there, while you simultaneously build power to also change aspects of that system to work. So an example of that in real life, after the knuckleheads at the state, thought it was interesting not to pay us, and eventually they did. Here in the city, where we have a more direct relationship with the mayor and his commissioner, MOME, and Gonzalo Casals at DCLA, they put together programs. We work with them to put together live music at vaccine sites. And at the point that was happening before mass vaccination, there was no live performance. So sort of changing the system in a way that's not normal. I'm not an employer. I negotiate for my members with employers, but we kind of turn the city into an employer, whether they liked it or not, to start these things. And Gonzalo at DCLA, I don't know if you know this, he ran a program to give out grants, not to organizations, but directly to artists. And I think those are sort of incremental.
We had to fight a lot for that.
Yes,
they
that I believe. Trust me, trust me. They're not easy, but again, it's small and it's not enough. On the labor question, I think the question is, do we have the same fight that labor more broadly does. It's all the same. It's everybody knows this by now. I guess I graduated graduate school in 2006. I started working in an orchestra in 2004. 2008, the economy, we had the Great Recession. I was in my mid-20s. I said, like, Adam, this is a crisis that will never, ever happen again. This is it. You just need to survive this. The arts just needs to pitch in, take some cuts. Everything will be great. Well, we got through that. There was a normal contraction in the arts economy. And frankly, when things recovered, we did not. We're always the last to recover. And then we saw what was extraordinary growth over the last decade, but yet again, another lo and behold, the crisis that'll never happen twice happens twice. And I'm sure there'll be others. And, at the end of the day, what you see in all of these crises is that the middle class or even lower class with artists are being crushed. We're being pushed out of the American economy. It's everybody's trying to figure out how, like, the 1%'s created, and there's such a great disparity. I can tell you, I negotiate these contracts. When you take away 25% of somebody's income every time there's a crisis, they're going to make less money over a long period of time. You're the expert. I was happy, but it's unfortunate that my real life experience is consistent with your research through a pandemic. But this is like what we face, and the labor movement. If there is a movement, and I think it's very popular now, which is great, but it's fragmented. There's different pieces that have different interests. There is a large group of labor that votes directly against their own economic interests, which is mind-blowing, but it happens. We saw it in 2016. And at the end of the day, we all have the same systemic problem. There is so much power on the other side of the table, and the way the law is structured, in the way we're unable to organize in a way that's meaningful. That it makes it extraordinarily hard to close that gap. And, in the good times, we're not closing that gap as much as we should. But so it's the same problem. The issue for artists that's unique to us is that the American public wants to see us succeed. They want to have music teachers or dance teachers or art teachers for their children because they believe in it. They want culture to exist. The problem is we've invented a system that doesn't make it possible necessarily for that to succeed. And it's a moral and ethical question that should be discussed more often.
Thank you. Well, I think we better end there. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the organizers and the Skirball, all the staff at Skirball.